All right, listen, Tremont's big O outcome is on the table. The DOJ is looking at breaking up Google. This is huge news in our industry. Last week, we talked about the ruling that Google had an illegal monopoly in search and advertising. The case was brought by Trump's DOJ back in 2020. Chemot said two outcomes are possible: little o, big O. Little o, consent decree, like Microsoft did back in 2000 with the Internet Explorer decision. The big O, we didn't think that was a major possibility, but here we are. Google getting broken up. DOJ is going big O. On Wednesday, Bloomberg reported the DOJ is considering a breakup. According to the article, most likely breakup targets are Android OS, Google Chrome, and AdWords. Okay. Last time the government tried to break up a monopoly was 20 years ago when they tried and failed to dismantle Microsoft. We know how that's gone. The company's doing great. So let's talk about it. Aside from search and advertising, there's kind of 5 pillars at Google, and you're a former Googler, so we'll go to you first, Freeberg, I think. Cloud, $40 billion in revenue, growing 30%. YouTube, $34 billion, growing 15%. A little volatile because it's advertising. That doesn't include like premium YouTube TV and that stuff. But oh my Lord, YouTube is up to 2.7 billion monthly active users. World population's 8.2, so quite significant. Netflix has $38 billion in revenue. They're worth almost $300 billion, so that's an interesting corollary. You got Waymo doing 50,000 paid trips a week now, 2.5 million a year, and that's growing quite nicely. You got Android, right? They don't disclose revenue. You got the G Suite. So let's start with you, Freeberg, and then I'll go to you, Chamath, because you made the prediction. What do you think would be accretive or generally increase the market cap and be something that Google would be happy with and the government would be happy with if you had to like maybe shed 1 or 2 properties? What's a possible outcome here? And your thoughts broadly on this.
I'll just start by commenting. I'm not really sure what the improvement to consumer pricing or competition would be in different breakup scenarios. I'd really like to understand the DOJ's analysis on that. How does breaking up one of these things improve the consumer experience? I could see the case for Android because Android defaults to Google search. But again, Android's an open source operating system. And so everyone has their own fork, or a lot of the handset manufacturers will have their own fork of Android. Obviously, the Google fork defaults to Google search. So it benefits Google services quite well. I think that would be an analysis that the DOJ would really have to kind of prove out, that there's real anti-competition associated with Google's influence over the open source Android operating system fork that they manage and license out. I think understanding that would be good. I do think that there's a lot of value unlock in YouTube. So if Google were to just generally spin out YouTube, that is probably a business that on its own would attract an investor base that might otherwise not want to get into the conglomerate. And there's always this notion of what's called a conglomerate discount. When you put a lot of different businesses together, the businesses in aggregate get valued less than the individual parts would be valued on their own, because different investors interested in a business investment thesis would like to bet on cloud, would like to bet on YouTube, would like to bet on AI. And so each one of these kind of like segments, if they can be unlocked, can actually be value creating in terms of overall market cap. The challenge is the way YouTube's infrastructure operates. It operates on shared infrastructure with the rest of Google services. So does cloud, so does search, so does AdWords. So there's one common cloud infrastructure that everything runs on. And then there's one common advertiser pool. There are dedicated advertising salespeople within YouTube, but there's also dedicated shared infrastructure on advertising between YouTube and search and AdSense and so on. And there's ad sales teams that actually can sell across search and third-party publisher sites and YouTube. And so, breaking up those shared teams becomes a little more technically difficult. But YouTube certainly seems like an unlock. The question is, what happens with all the infrastructure layer? Does that go with cloud? And if it does, then YouTube, AdWords, and search all become customers of cloud. So that might be one way that this could work. But I think net, if this were to happen, there could be a lot of upside in the market cap. I'll also say it just feels like the tenor of all of this is anti-success and not anti-competition. And anything that's kind of successful or big is automatically deemed to be a monopoly. And I think we really have to kind of understand how are consumers and the market for competition being affected by having all these things together. And that's what should really be focused on and studied, not just the fact that something is big and successful. And we'll see how that all plays out.
All right, Chamath, you predicted the possibility of a big O. Here we are. Your thoughts on what this might look like, chances of it happening, and then just maybe if you're interested in the anti-success approach here, or do you think this is more, valid criticism of Google's massive search monopoly?
Well, when I painted that series of outcomes, just kind of like looking forward, I really didn't think that this big O outcome was a very large probability. I was like, I would have handicapped that at single digit percentages. And I think the reason why the DOJ leaked this thing and floated this trial balloon essentially is in part, I didn't weigh enough what Sachs was talking about, which is that there really is a massive bipartisan amount of support against Google. Now, it cuts on two different dimensions. I think that there's one dimension which is more Republican oriented, which is just about freedom of speech and putting your thumb on the scale. But if you take the Democratic point of view, it's more the anti-successful vein that Freeberg just mentioned. The thing is, though, that it'll make strange bedfellows because it unites both sides against pushing for a big outcome. If you go back to the last big O outcome that we had in antitrust law, which was AT&T in the 70s and 80s, that lawsuit was a decade long, right? And essentially what happened was when it looked like AT&T was going to lose the case, they were the ones that proposed splitting itself up. And so I think that this is going to start this really interesting chess game here, where obviously Google has to appeal and fight this. But if it looks like the political pressure is going to build and the courts aren't going to let them off the hook and have a little O outcome, probably the best thing to do is for Google to initiate it themselves, because they can answer a lot of the questions that Friedberg just raised. And they'll do it in a way where, going back to the people that matter along with the customers and the employees are the shareholders, you can do it in a way where the sum of the parts will be greater than the value today of Google. So I think that there's a shareholder win. It needs to be offered by Google and then negotiated. But to be really honest with you, Jason, when I kind of was thinking about it last week, I really thought this was a single digit probability. I still think it's a single digit probability. And if it grows, it's the most meaningful thing that's happened in technology, quite honestly.
All right, Sachs.
From a business perspective.
Cool. Sachs, your thoughts?
I agree with Chamath that Google has the opportunity to do something really interesting here, which is get ahead of the curve and break itself up before the political system forces that onto it. And the advantage of doing that is that it could partition the company in ways that are economically smart. The big categories would be search, advertising, and YouTube. And I think that would have two big economic benefits for shareholders. One is you unlock value by deconglomerating, like Freeberg was saying. Second, once you break up the company into these pieces, there's less places for employees who aren't doing anything to hide, for all this bureaucracy to hide. I mean, look, Google is famous for employees who don't do anything, right? The guys sitting on the roof, sunning themselves all day. If you break up the company into 3 or 4 smaller companies, right, there's just way less room for people to hide. And I think that they could all be leaner, more efficient operations, and that would accrue to the benefit of shareholders. So I think that would make a lot of sense. And then furthermore, I guess a third point is that you forestall the possibility of the government doing something that could actually be very harmful. And, the piece here is that I guess the DOJ is talking about spinning up Android and Chrome. And I think it's worth pointing out that those aren't really businesses in and of themselves. The reason why Google developed Android and Chrome was to prevent anybody from getting upstream of them, right? They saw what Microsoft did in terms of capturing the operating system and then capturing the browser, and they didn't want to potentially allow Microsoft or anyone else to essentially win the high ground, capture the high ground upstream of them, and be able to divert traffic away from search to their own search engine or someone else's search engine. So they began this strategy of commoditizing those layers of the stack. And it worked brilliantly. I mean, Android and Chrome have become very popular, and it guarantees that nobody else can get upstream of them and then disintermediate them. But the problem is, if those things get spun out and have to become businesses on their own, how would they function as businesses? It's not clear to me that there's an obvious strategy there. I would like to ask Freeberg. Freeberg, do you see a way that Chrome and Android could be spun out and become viable businesses on their own? Or do you agree that they were essentially created to commoditize layers of the stack rather than become profitable businesses on their own?
Yeah, so they were both created to avoid third parties blocking access to Google search. That's why they were both started. And remember, Sundar was the product manager on Chrome originally. That was his big kind of product that he ran for quite some time. So Android was all about making sure that the handset manufacturers didn't basically default consumers to do search and use the internet in a way that would disadvantage Google. So Google said, you know what, just like Zuck is doing currently with Llama, Google said, let's make an open source mobile operating system that's better than any other mobile operating system. And we'll make sure that consumers have choice and they have the ability to go where they want to go. And it's not just defaulted by the telcos or the handset manufacturers. So that was the reason. And obviously they ended up making their own fork of Android, which is the most popular fork of Android that has Google as a default search engine. So yeah, and they get license fees from that. But fundamentally, it's really just in service of making sure that people go to Google search. So where that ends up sitting in a split up company, I have no idea. And Chrome similarly, Google originally supported Firefox and gave a lot of money to Firefox. And then Firefox just wasn't moving fast enough. So Google started hiring Firefox engineers and built Chrome in-house as a way to keep Netscape and Internet Explorer from blocking access to Google search and defaulting. And they built a default to Google search, obviously.
What do you think, Jacob?
I have a long relationship with Google as a content creator, and they do have a massive monopoly in search. That's absolutely true. And the Justice Department, I think, is well within their rights to take a deep dive on that. They don't have it in ads. If you look at the competition for Google in advertising, you got Meta, TikTok, and Amazon, which have very, very significant advertising businesses, and then like a bunch of new players, which are referred to basically as the shopping cart ad networks. That's Uber, Instacart, DoorDash, et cetera. And so when you look at this, it's kind of paradoxical that it really does rhyme with what happened with Microsoft. They're 2 decades late on this. The search monopoly has been squeezed for every dollar and to build every subcomponent of Google's monopoly. Flights, shopping, all of these things put into Google search and put at the top above organic search has basically killed hundreds of startups over the decades. And so I actually don't think this is going to do much if they do a breakup. The easy solution for Google, and I agree with, I think, people who said that here, is to just spin out YouTube and Waymo. Those two are perfect standalone businesses. Yeah, there's some back-end stuff, but like you said, Freeberg, they could become customers of the ad network of the cloud for some number of years. But YouTube and Waymo, those should be like a $400 billion company, a $50 billion company, and those are right in the zeitgeist of the future and what advertisers want. So I think offering those two up would unlock massive shareholder value. The most damaging one would be Android. If they force them to sell Android, that is going to be massively damaging because an independent Android company could then, give their search default to Bing, and Microsoft would happily bid for that.
Not could. They must in order to capture maximum economic value.
Right.
They would auction it, right? And so, losing
on Google's fork of Android, right?
Correct. And so that is the dominant player. And then they have handsets. So Android
how much is
company,
that worth? How much is that worth? Because maybe that does make Android a viable business on its own.
Well, it would be
it's probably $30 billion of revenue a year.
Okay, great. So let's do it. I take back what I said. It can survive as an independent business. Chrome can't, right? Chrome can't. But maybe Android and Chrome go together.
That would be incredibly damaging to Google. That's the most damaging. The easiest is YouTube and Waymo in this whole mix. But I'll give you the wild card in all of this.
Think about the math. Sorry, just real quick. Think about the math on that. So let's say it spins out and it generates $30 billion of revenue a year, and Google owns the majority of it, and eventually they'll sell it down. But that business will be valued on the money that Google's paying. So Google will make that equity value back because they own the shares.
And they will lose 1/3 of their revenue to that new company. Now, of course, they'll get it back in the equity, but then they don't have it because about 1/3 of searches are mobile now, and that's increasing. The big wild card in all this is Apple. When I was doing Mahalo, which was a human-powered search engine over 10 years ago, that's Sequoia backed, I emailed it to Steve Jobs. He opened it. He played with it a bunch. I won't talk about anything else in that regard. But they had a search project in the works when Steve Jobs was in charge over there. They were looking at search because he had such an axe to grind with Eric Schmidt because they launched Android and he kicked Eric Schmidt off the board. And there was a lot of hand-wringing there. I think Apple is, and I've heard this from folks around Apple, that they're looking at search again. And there's DuckDuckGo and there's a company called Brave that has their own search engine, search API that's gotten very popular. I believe Apple's going to launch their own search engine and compete heads up with Google. And so I think that's going to be the very interesting thing that happens in this market. The question then becomes, Chamath, does this distract management to a level like it did Microsoft, and you have a lost decade and it takes their eyes off the prize of AI?
No. And the reason I say no is that I think that people's reaction to these things become more sophisticated in time because folks go back and actually study what happened in the Ma Bell situation, AT&T and the RBox, what happened in Microsoft. And so I suspect that they know how to shield the rank and file employee from whatever is going to happen. So I think that that's less likely.
I was referring to management, Like, do you think it distracts management from running the business, Chamath?
I don't think so either, because I think that these things get put into a very tight group of people, mostly lawyers, who then go and deal with this issue. I think that there's an acute moment where if they think that they're going to lose an appeal or that appeal is not going to get heard, then yeah, I do think management and the board are brought together. And again, if history is a guide, they should want to propose the terms on which they break their own company up. Because I think if the government tries to decide, there's going to be so much imprecision that they'll break the company. And I think that would be a shame because, I mean, look, take a step back. The breaking up of Google is great for competition and for startups. But let's not forget, Google is an incredible company that has created enormous amounts of good. They have done way more good than bad, way more, like 3, 4, 5 orders of magnitude more good than bad. And to break a company like that, I think would be a really bad outcome. From a competitive dynamics perspective and game theory, it's pretty reasonable to hobble them. That's why I think the small O outcome is much more palatable and seems more fair to me. A breakup is a really draconian action. And I'm not sure that when you look at Google versus AT&T and the baby bells, I don't think it's anywhere near the same. But if there's the political will, they'll be able to craft and change some of the laws that allow these folks to just keep going after them. And if that happens, I think it's going to be really important for Google to define the terms of their own breakup.
I want to just underline what Chamath said real quick. Being big can be very good in the sense that it can drive an ability to invest in innovation that is not possible without the scale and the significant cash flow that's being generated by being that big. And AT&T is a great example. Bell Labs. So the way AT&T was set up is there was all the local telephone companies under this Bell system that AT&T owned. And then Western Electric was the company that manufactured all the telephone equipment that was put into the telephone system. And then Bell Labs was the third entity. It was the research arm. And all that they did at Bell Labs was do research, and they were fully funded. They had all this cash flow pouring into them, so they could discover and work on and invent whatever they wanted. With that capital, Bell Labs is so insane. If you guys haven't read any of the books on Bell Labs and what was discovered there and how it operated, it truly is like the most innovative center ever in human history. But they invented like antenna arrays, they invented microwaves, they invented radar, they invented the transistor, they invented information theory, which was the basis for everything in the internet. There was even some efforts to try and invent a nuclear bomb before the Manhattan Project started. They invented integrated circuits and on and on and on and on. And that's because they could invest all this money in doing this research that would have been very difficult for a small startup or a company that's trying to grow and is barely profitable to be able to do. At Google, they've invested billions of dollars in Waymo. And I think, as we all know, Waymo really was, if not the leader, but the inspiration for a whole generation of autonomous driving that ultimately will come to market and will really transform our lives in a meaningful way. In the same way, Amazon and Microsoft and Meta have all invested tens of billions of dollars in innovation. Look at what Zuck is doing at Meta with the open sourcing of the Llama models. It's incredible. That would have never been possible if you had a small company that was trying to get profitable. So I just want to highlight, like, these businesses, just because they're big and successful, doesn't necessarily mean that they're stifling innovation. In fact, they may be accelerating innovation and enabling progress. I'm just pointing out that the cash flows that are being generated and the way they're investing those cash flows is pretty impressive. And we lose that if we end up going after every big company just because they're big and saying, hey, we should take away their ability to do this.
I'm going to take the other side of that. I think that what they can do with their massive amount of power is destructive to competition in the marketplace. If you look at self-driving, we have had tens of billions of dollars invested. Without Waymo, it would have been just fine. There have been so much money, Tesla, Uber, Cruise, GM. There's plenty of people out there. There's plenty of capital out there from around the world. And I think when these companies, and Facebook's one, I think proves my point, what you're saying here is, I think it would be better that you didn't have these companies that could put $20 billion into something and you had 50 startups go after it rather than these giant companies just steal it and overpower them, flooding them with capital. It makes the world less dynamic that Zuck can just, and Google can keep taking the next category from the marketplace. Go ahead, Sachs, you had a point?
If you break Google up from a conglomerate of, let's call it, four monopolies or duopolies or companies with extraordinary market power into four separate companies, they're still going to be generating extraordinary profits, and those could still be invested in a Waymo. So I don't know that it stops the innovation. Our workshopping this issue has pretty much convinced me that it should be four companies: search, advertising, YouTube, and Android, because I think Android could be a standalone business because of the value of the search
cloud
default.
Go? Cloud isn't search or advertising.
That's got to be figured out. I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it's a negotiation now. Maybe they put up one or two to be spun out, and then the negotiation happens. And who knows, you could have regime change in Washington